to the CESA 2 Educator Capacity Podcast, where we strive to improve student learning by expanding the capacity of our school districts. Special thanks to Miss Liz Elliott from Whitewater Middle School for providing the music for this podcast. I'm your host, Phil Anderson, and I'm joined today once again by co-host Mijajlovic. How are you doing today, Mijajl?
Hey Phil, good. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for asking. Today, we're going to introduce a very important topic for our schools, that being racial bias. Wisconsin has one of the largest grading gaps between black and white students according to research, and we're all looking for ways to close this gap. Researchers, such as Dave Quinn, our guest today, are looking to mitigate this bias.
In today's episode, we have CESA 2 consultants Mary Jo Ziegler and Stephen Mijajlovic joined with Dr. David Quinn, who is an assistant professor in the K-12 policy concentration at the School of Education at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on measuring, explaining, and ending racial, ethnic, and class-based educational inequalities. His most recent research paper, How to Reduce Racial Bias in Grading, will be the focus of our conversation today. You can read the full article in the podcast description as well. Mary Jo is our director of the Curriculum and Coaching Center of Excellence with over 30 years of education experience. She has a master's degree in both reading and educational leadership, with roles ranging coaching at Sherman Middle School in Madison, Wisconsin, being a director of instruction, and many more. Also from our Curriculum and Coaching Center of Excellence, Stephen Mijajlovic has over 10 years of experience in mathematics and STEM across all grade levels. He's taught and coached in Chicago public schools and the suburbs prior to CESA 2, and has a Master of Science in Education with a focus in secondary mathematics education from Northwestern University.
Without further ado, here's a conversation with Dr. David Quinn.
All right, so in mid-November, Dave published an article in EdNext titled How to Reduce Racial Bias in Grading, which highlights new research that supports a simple, low-cost teaching tool. And we're excited to talk to Dave about his article, learn more about it, and the research that might help us take another step in the right direction here in Wisconsin. And as our listeners most likely know, Wisconsin has the nation's largest gap between Black and white students' academic success of any state. And that's according to NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Education Progress. And it's also known as the nation's report card. So just starting off, Dave, could you tell us a little bit more about your key findings connected to the article in your research that you wrote titled How to Reduce Racial Bias in Grading?
Sure. Hi. First of all, hello. Thanks for having me. So for this study, I had two main hypotheses. The first was that teachers would exhibit racial bias in their evaluation of students when they were using vague evaluation scales. But secondly, that when teachers were using rubrics with clearly specified evaluation criteria, that bias would be reduced or perhaps even eliminated. The results of the experiment showed evidence for both of those two hypotheses. So teachers were evaluating a second grade writing sample, and I can explain more about the design of the study as well, but I found that teachers were less likely to rate a version of the student writing sample written by a Black student, less likely to write it as on grade level or above compared to an identical writing sample purportedly written by a white student. But when they used the grading rubric, there were no differences in the scores that teachers gave to the writing.
Very interesting. And you mentioned that you could speak a little bit more about the study design. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So the experiment was an online experiment with a national teacher sample, and teachers were randomly assigned to view one of two different versions of a writing sample. They were told that the writing sample was produced by a student in the fall of second grade in response to the prompt to write about their weekend. And it was, a photograph of a student writing sample written in student handwriting. So it was, an authentic writing sample. And the two different versions were identical, except for one thing. So in the writing sample, the student refers to his brother by name. In one version, the brother's name was Deshaun, and the other version, the brother's name was Connor. And these are names that I took from the Dunbar and Levitt list of the most racially distinct names. So, one version signals a Black student author, the other signals a white student author. Otherwise, they're identical. And then they're asked to rate the writing sample on two different scales. So one scale was this vague grade level evaluation scale, just going from far below grade level up to far above grade level. And the second rating scale was an actual second grade writing rubric for a personal narrative that had clearly specified performance levels that the teacher had to rate the sample on. And when they used the vague grade level scale, teachers were 5 percentage points less likely to rate the black student version as being on grade level or above compared to the white student version. But when they used that more specified rubric, there was no evidence of any differences in the way that they evaluated the writing.
So when I read through the article, it said something about figuring out what implicit biases the teachers had. And I found that to be a really interesting piece as well, because the way I interpreted it anyway, what it sounded like was when they had the rubric, even if they had significant implicit bias, they were able to, the rubric was able to nullify that. Is that is that a correct interpretation? And can you talk a little bit more about how you determined how much implicit bias they had?
Yeah, so that's right. So the hypothesis, one of the hypotheses I had going into this study was that when teachers showed higher levels of implicit racial bias, they would also show larger magnitudes of bias when they were using the vague evaluation scale. So I administered in this study an implicit association test, or IAT. Many people will probably be familiar with it, but it's a computerized time classification test, and it's one of the most commonly used measures of implicit racial bias. People who are not familiar with it, who are interested, can Google Project Implicit Harvard, and you'll be able to see the test and take it. But I administered a version of that test, and I was expecting that when people showed higher levels of bias on that implicit association test, they would also show larger magnitudes of evaluation bias on the vague scale. But what I found was that there was no difference in the magnitude of bias depending on people's measured levels of implicit bias. So, in other words, if a teacher scored high on implicit bias, or if they scored low on implicit bias, they were equally likely to show evaluation bias of the student work on the vague grade level scale. But again, on average, teachers did not show that same bias on the rubric.
So I feel like that then kind of connects back with um, Hattie's research around teacher clarity, right? Because if districts invest time in helping teachers be really clear around the criteria that they're going to use to assess students, even if there is some implicit bias within, which there is, right? Even though there is implicit bias within our systems, there is a better chance that students are getting fair evaluation, basically.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's an important takeaway. So it does seem as though the rubric is helpful for mitigating bias across the board. So it's not only the least biased teachers who the rubric is effective at mitigating bias for. In this study, the evidence suggests that it's effective overall across the board. Now, I should also say though, there's always the possibility that the measure of implicit bias, the IAT, is not picking up the kinds of implicit biases that are relevant for this grading task. So there's a lot of debate in the literature right now about what IATs actually measure, and it does seem clear that in the least there's a lot of noise in implicit bias measures. So there's some signal there, but people's implicit bias scores in the IAT vary a lot over time if you retake it. And so there's a lot of noise in this measure just by the way it's constructed. And so it may just be something about the nature of this measure that makes it difficult to detect higher or lower magnitudes of grading bias based on your scores on the IAT.
So one thing that's really resonating with me is that idea that the rubrics help nullify that implicit bias. It levels it out. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about some details of the rubrics so some of our listeners can think about how can I start experimenting with rubrics in my classroom.
Yeah, so I can read exactly what the rubric was here. So it was the rubric that I used was just a basic second grade writing rubric for a personal narrative that I found online from some school district website. It was the rubric that they used. So I kept it simple because it's a short writing sample, the easiest to use in an experiment. But the rubric had four performance levels from fails to recount an event, attempts to recount an event, recounts an event with some detail, or provides a well elaborated recount of an event. And so the nice thing about this finding here is that teachers were just shown this rubric for the first time in the experiment, and they were asked to evaluate the writing sample using that rubric without any previous kind of training. So you might worry that rubrics would need some sort of training and norming to get teachers to be using it right to reduce the bias. But in this study, at least, that kind of extensive training was not necessary. Just seeing the rubric for the first time and being forced to engage their mind in comparing the student writing to the performance levels was enough to crowd out the influence that their implicit biases might have potentially had when they were grading the student writing.
It's really interesting, and it just makes me think about what Mary Jo was talking about with teacher clarity, and if we can be clear about what we want students to learn and how will we know when they've reached that point, that success criteria. If we're clear about that, even in this case, it could really help mitigate the implicit bias within the classrooms.
Yeah, I think that that point Mary Jo made is an important one about the clarity of the learning objectives. There are many benefits to having clear learning objectives. It helps teacher design the instruction, it helps the students because they know what they want to learn. And the results from this experiment also suggest that an additional benefit is that it can reduce racial bias in grading. And I would suspect it would also reduce other types of bias, not just black white racial bias as well. Although I don't have the direct evidence of that in this particular experiment. But yes, I see these results as consistent with a lot of the arguments that folks make for standards-based grading and mastery grading. Although the elimination of bias in grading is not always one of the justifications that you hear, one of the benefits that you hear that goes along with those kinds of instructional regimes. But it does seem as though that is one additional important benefit of them.
Well, and I think about from my perspective as a curriculum and coaching leader, the power of getting teachers together in their grade level teams to actually do some of the thinking around what are our outcome goals, what are our success criteria, are we aligned in those success criteria across our grade level classrooms, and that idea of consistency and how that could then lead to equity. I feel like the research and the work that you've done here really gives a lot of, or adds to the power of that work. And to me, anyway, makes it seem even more part of an essential part of what schools might be doing with their professional learning time or their PLC time.
Yeah, absolutely. That determining those criteria and the standards beforehand that you were just discussing is an important piece of it because there is research showing that when people are evaluating, so this is research not in education, but evaluation of job candidates, that if the criteria are not established beforehand, then people's biases can lead them to preferring criteria that favor people from the groups that they prefer. And when you establish those criteria beforehand, that's one pathway that you shut down that through which bias can affect your decision. So doing that kind of work collaboratively and monitoring over time how teachers are actually implementing it is very important. I agree.
Thanks for sharing that, Dave. So one of the other things that I noticed was that some of your research that you've done is around teachers' racial attitudes and the effects of it in terms of educational inequity and how educators apply that in our practice in the classroom with students. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that insight as well.
Sure. So one study I recently published with some co-authors was looking at the association between aggregate levels of teachers' implicit bias and disparities in student outcomes. So we found that at the county level, average levels of teachers' implicit bias, implicit racial bias, as measured by the IAT, was associated with county level disparities in student test scores between Black and white students and county level disparities in suspension rates of Black and white students. So, in counties where the average teacher has higher pro white or anti Black implicit bias, those counties also tend to have larger test score differences between Black and white students and larger suspension disparities between Black and white students. So this is important in showing the relationship between people's attitudes and the actual outcomes of students. Of course, this particular study was a correlational study, so it doesn't necessarily tell us that interventions that are successful at changing teachers' attitudes or reducing their implicit bias will also necessarily improve racial test score disparities or reduce suspension disparities. We don't, unfortunately, have any great evidence in education for interventions that are effective at reducing implicit bias of teachers and through that also improving student outcomes. Based just on kind of theory and some research from outside of education, my guess would be my best bet would be that the interventions that would be most effective at improving student outcomes by way of changing teachers' racial attitudes will be a combination of the kinds of structural interventions like using rubrics and kinds of putting safeguards in place to reduce the impact that teachers' negative racial attitudes can have on students, along with training that also works on changing teachers' racial attitudes. And there, I would look to the professional development literature more broadly to see some ideas of what might be effective. We know that professional development needs to be intense and it needs to be sustained over time. So some sort of collaborative work along the lines of what Mary Jo was describing, where teachers are working together to reduce their implicit attitudes, identify the way that implicit bias may be playing out in the classroom, and then over time trying to continually improve that.
But what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what it sounds like to me is that your rubric work seems like as something that you could put in place more quickly and have a quicker impact while you're working on the slower impact of changing attitudes, because that's about belief systems. So while that would be a long, slow process in changing those more adaptive pieces, these technical pieces could be put in place to have an impact quickly. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Would you say?
that's exactly right. So reducing racial bias and changing people's attitudes, as you said, is it's not an instant process. And when you eventually get to the point where you can improve teachers' racial attitudes where it's a problem, then there's less to worry about implicit bias affecting students because the teachers don't have implicit bias. That's a lofty goal and it's very difficult to get to. And there are ways that despite the fact that we all hold these implicit biases, there are ways to reduce the influence that they have on our behaviors. So the most immediate effective way of reducing the impact of implicit bias may not be to try to change what's in people's minds, but rather to have structures in place that reduce the influence that what's in people, that the things that are in people's minds have on their actions and on students.
So are there other things, you know, ideas or things that you're researching connected to that, like other technical sorts of fixes that could also, along with rubrics, could be next steps for schools in order to have a more rapid impact on student outcomes?
Yeah, there are a few things. So, in terms of safeguards, if we're thinking about grading in particular, um, implicit biases are most likely to influence people's behaviors or judgments when they are making decisions or performing tasks when they're under time constraint, when they're fatigued, when they're stressed. And so these, of course, are conditions that teachers experience quite often. So any ways of making sure that there are not strict time limits on grading, or there are opportunities for teachers to make sure that they're not grading under those conditions of fatigue, stress. Those would be helpful. Um, there are also some things, sort of, maybe this would be a bit more of a medium term sort of a solution, but teacher recruitment is also one piece of this. So we know that there's really good evidence that for Black students, having a Black teacher improves their student their outcomes in terms of test scores, in terms of disciplinary actions, in terms of future college going. And so increasing the number of teachers of color and of Black teachers in particular is also a helpful way of making sure that we're improving outcomes for Black students. But not just recruitment, also the retention piece. So making sure that we're able to retain the teachers of color that we have.
So I'm wondering if we could just go back a moment to when you shared about the county level IAT scores and how some of the correlation findings were around there being a larger gap in scores between Black and white students. And when you um, shared these findings, perhaps with districts in the area of Southern California, what were some next steps that those districts, regions, schools took based on that?
Well, I can't point to any specific actions that schools took in direct response to this study. Schools now and districts are giving a lot more focused attention on issues of racial equity and on racial bias. And so a lot of districts are, of course, implementing these new anti-bias trainings for their teachers, which is probably a good first step to take. But as I was sort of alluding to earlier, I think it would be a mistake to believe that you could have a training session or two on implicit bias and then expect that the problem has been solved. Changing racial attitudes is a long process. It requires a sustained effort, and I think that will require sustained attention in addition to some of the kind of policies and structures that I was suggesting earlier.
So if you were in charge of a district, right, and they had the significant bias that we've talked about, what would be your action steps in order to try to address that situation in the school?
Well, I think it would be a combination of things. One piece would be the sort of sustained effort I was talking about earlier. So I would have there would be a knowledge component to the training where people are learning about implicit bias. We have to recognize, so as with any kind of professional development, there's wide variation in the skills and knowledge that teachers have to begin with. And so targeting the professional development is going to be an important element of this. You shouldn't just expect a kind of a one size fits all anti-bias training to meet everybody's needs. There are going to be some teachers who already are strong anti-racist educators, and those may be the teachers who you pick to lead the PLC efforts, the collaborative efforts. But there will be teachers for whom that kind of knowledge that knowledge level training is important, but everyone can always improve from an inquiry process. So if there's an inquiry process around how teachers' racial attitudes, implicit biases are affecting their students, then there's always areas of improvement that can be identified, and identifying those areas in a collaborative setting, and then coming up with targeted learning related to the problems of practice that are coming up, and having a sustained focus on improving them over time is what I would expect to have um, the most impact there.
And what are one or two action steps that you might recommend for our teachers listening to this so that they can make a positive impact and better support our students here in Wisconsin?
Mm. Well, one additional thing, so specifically with the question of racial equity and racial bias in teachers, there's also good evidence that having a review and accountability system in place can be helpful in slowing teachers down and making sure that implicit biases are not inadvertently influencing their behaviors and their actions. So when it comes to something like suspension disparities between Black and white students, there's an element to that that has to do with the decision making of the teacher of whether or not to refer the student. And if there's kind of an external review process where there's a third party who is reviewing incident disciplinary incidents, comparing race of suspension by race and the reasons that students are being suspended, then just the simple awareness that that decision will be reviewed is a helpful check on teachers to make sure that they're asking themselves, is my decision now, say, to discipline this student, or my reaction to this student driven by a racial bias? And by slowing down and thinking about that, that can also be a helpful step in reducing some of those disparities.
Are there other data systems that you can think of that people might want to build continuous review? I agree. I mean, I think suspension data is important. Uh, Disciplinary referrals. Are there other pieces of data that you think might be valuable in a continuous improvement process or an inquiry process to be a part of that review that schools and districts might want to make sure they pull out and focus on?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I could imagine a similar kind of review process around grading and student evaluation, student academic outcomes. There's student teacher relationships are also quite important, and one of the hypothesized mechanisms behind why we see these racial match effects that I was referring to earlier, where Black students experience better outcomes on average when they're taught by a Black teacher compared to a white teacher. One of the hypothesized mechanisms has to do with teachers' expectations of the students, and also the relationships that teachers build with students, and the kind of student surveys and student feedback about their teachers can also be an important source of understanding how teachers may be differentially forming different kinds of relationships with students, differently based on their race and the race of the student. So yes, student feedback, I think, can also be a useful data point there.
Right. And that's, to me, that's one of those areas that we don't often pay much attention to, right? Like, let's ask the students who's helping them and who's meeting their needs and what they need more of in order to be successful in our school. So thank you.
So I guess to wrap us up, this was really helpful. It was great to learn more about the study and be able to ask some questions and some follow-up questions about that. I'm wondering, what are some things that that are in the works for you in terms of research, and what are some things that we might be able to expect to see coming from you in the future?
Sure. Yeah. Well, right now, my research is focusing on the effects of issue frames for equity and racial equity in education. So I've done some work. I have a couple studies out there right now about the effects of the so-called achievement gap discourse on people's racial attitudes and stereotypes. And this is work that was inspired by Gloria Ladson Billings and other scholars who have written about the unintended consequences that the achievement gap frame can have on the way that people think about inequity. So by focusing on student level outcomes, people are more likely to kind of, or maybe more likely to blame students rather than looking to structural inequalities that are leading to the disparities in student outcomes. And in some initial work, I found evidence that even just the term racial achievement gap can lead people to give lower priority levels to the issue compared to racial inequality in educational outcomes, which, substantively synonymous, but carry different connotations. And so the place that I'm heading now in some of my work is to look for more productive ways about talking about educational inequalities. And so, one prime candidate is the opportunity gap frame that a lot of people prefer over the achievement gap frame. And so I'm going to be looking at how using these different frames influences the way that people think about the problem, the source that they identified for the problem, and the kinds of policies that they support as solutions to the problem. So are people more likely to support equity advancing policies when the opportunity gap frame is presented to them as opposed to the achievement gap frame?
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And I think about in the state of Wisconsin, as well as federally, many of the policies that are in place right now and the challenges that some of those policies are creating for schools. And so to me, any research that can be done that can influence our policymakers to think of things, think from another perspective would be really beneficial. So, sounds great.
Yeah, and that use of language just reminds me of something that Ken Williams from Solution Tree talks about with when you think about at-risk students versus underserved students, and just how those simple language definitions really frame how we think and talk about students.
Right? That
Yeah,
whole institutional responsibility and societal responsibility versus family and student responsibility. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and here in California, actually recently, the governor signed a bill that would strike the at-risk language from all state laws, and so it's now at promise instead of at risk. So I think that these kinds of framings are important for how people think about the problems. There's always the risk that people might end up focusing too much on language and not enough on actual, distribution of resources and like what's actually happening in like quality of instruction, these kinds of things. But the framing is important for how it influences what people actually do, and how resources get allocated and what solutions get enacted. So it's an important first step, I think, to make sure that people are pursuing solutions that are going to be most effective at advancing the equity that we all want to see.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dave. We really appreciate you joining us, taking the time out of your day to share some of your findings, some of your research, some of your thinking with us. I know I've learned a lot just in our short conversation. So thank you for taking the time today, and I really appreciate it.
That was great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks very much to both of you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Many thanks to Dr. Dave Quinn, Mary Jo, and Stephen for our conversation today. As I mentioned before, I think this is a very important conversation to discuss. I think some of the solutions mentioned, such as the knowledge training and accountability board, are going to be very helpful to our districts. This isn't something that's going to change overnight, but I think it can help us begin to look at our own bias and bring about the change that we're looking for.
Yeah, Phil, I couldn't agree more. Dr. David Quinn touched on a lot of great topics here. Having clear learning objectives are extremely important in how they can reduce racial bias in grading, and how they likely could reduce other biases as well. So clear learning objectives, his points on that were fantastic. And also the action steps, like you mentioned, having a review system in place, and the specific data points that Dave mentioned. So helpful.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening today, everybody. You can find all the resources for today's conversation in the podcast description or on CESA2.org. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. Join us next time as we hold a discussion with proof positive and the importance of our actions affecting our mental well-being. We'll see you next time.